If you have any questions for our panelists at any point during the talk, we ask that you put them in the Q&A function and not the chat. With so many of us gathered here today, it may be difficult to see questions that are in the chat function. If you are using a mobile device, the Q&A function may be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. This evening's program is being co-presented with the Princeton Adult School. This excellent long-standing Princeton institution is just about to present a lecture series that might be of interest, American Perspectives 2020, Who We Are. I'll drop a link in the chat about that shortly. There are 8 lectures with renowned speakers, and I encourage you to take a look. And now on to this evening's program. It is my honor to introduce the incisive, wise, generous, thought-provoking Ingrid Reed. Reed is a policy analyst focusing on New Jersey civic affairs. She directed the New Jersey project at Rutgers Eagleton Institute of Politics from 1996 until she retired in June 2010, I believe. Also one of the founders of a successful startup, New Jersey Spotlight, a civic journalism website designed to provide coverage of current state issues important to its communities. Who better than to moderate a discussion with the two speakers she'll introduce this evening. Please join me in welcoming Ingrid Reed.
Well, thank you, Kim, to you and the Princeton Public Library and the Princeton Adult School. It's really a privilege to be back for a third time at the beginning of January, and each time to have Steve Kornacki with us. And I guess it's getting to either be a tradition or an annual event. We'll have to see how we label it. And I think most people know that Steve Kornacki got his start in New Jersey, but now is the NBC and MSNBC national political correspondent. And many people just refer to him as that guy on the whiteboard. But we know that there's much more to Steve, and we're looking forward to hearing from him. And I'm delighted to say that tonight, Steve and I thought it would be good to have Patrick Murray join us. He's a very incisive person. He's the director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute. And I should put the adjective esteemed, because I think it is really one of the most highly regarded polls. And we're going to hear more about that. We're going to save some good time toward the end of the program to discuss polling more, because a lot of people are interested in it. I also want to thank Patrick for his leadership of the organization, the Crossroads of the American Revolution. Did I get the name right, Patrick?
Right. Our national heritage area here in New Jersey.
Okay, and I just learned, and I'm going to let Patrick say this first before we get into the discussion. What did you just put up that I think people, especially in the Princeton area, would be interested, but anybody who's listening would be interested?
Yes, in the run-up to 2026 and the nation's 250th anniversary, for which we're planning quite a few activities as the state's official private partner in this. And by the way, we're asking Governor Murphy to invest a significant amount of money to bring our state historic sites like Princeton Battlefield up to snuff so they can receive visitors and we can be one of the top visitor destinations, not only for 2026 and beyond. So call the governor and tell him to fund that request. But one of the things that we're doing, thinking about, the ways that we need to get around nowadays, not just COVID inspired, but I think this is going to live beyond it, is create self-driving audio tours. So, many of us in this area who live in this area know things happened, and we might know some of the things that happened along the highways and byways that we drive every day, but not everything. And, one of the most important events not only in the Revolutionary War, but in all of American history happened right here in Mercer County. And is the 10 crucial days, the Washington crossing the Delaware through the battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton. And we created an audio tour, that self-driving audio tour that takes you from the encampments at New Hope, crosses the river, takes you through the march to Trenton, the 2 battles, and then up the road to Princeton. And describes things that happened along the way, such as along what's now Route 206, the delaying tactics and so forth. And you hear these descriptions by the people who lived them and who were there at the time. And this is all self-guided. The tour gives you directions and everything. So go to revolutionarynj.org. That's revolutionarynj.org, and look for the audio tour app. You can download it to your phone. And as I said, once you do, you plug it into your car, it takes you to the entire tour. Just takes you the whole way. And it's really, there's music from our local musicians, the fifes and drums, and a lot of local folks actually contributed to this tour as well. And we're going to have more. So the tour actually ends in Princeton. It ends in the parking lot right next to Morven, behind the old municipal building there. And our next tour is actually going to take that as our starting point, which is the road to Morristown, the days after the 10 Crucial Days. So we'll have more in Princeton coming up in the next few months.
Okay, thank you for that promotion, Patrick. We have to promote Steve's book, The Red and the Blue.
Oh, yeah.
Still very relevant. In fact, I'm going to start our discussion, Steve, with you sort of looking back that the book basically starts around 1990, if I recall, right? And I thought maybe it would be good for you to sort of trace the midterm elections that we may have forgotten, but maybe even participated in, to give us a sense of how important they are and how varied the outcomes are in the election, but then how varied the influence of the outcome of the election on the next administration. Because I think everybody is thinking of this election we're going to be participating in is not just electing people who are on the ballot, but what its implication is. So give us a little history lesson of recent times, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, and thank you for for putting this event together. I remember 2 years ago, the first one, there were a couple hundred people. We were all together, and I hope for the next one of these next year, maybe we'll be back. We'll be back to that.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
Look forward to. But I mean, the book I wrote a couple of years ago, The Red and the Blue. The idea is it's political history of the 1990s, and the idea of the book is that concept, the concept of red states and blue states, of red America and blue America, is something that grew out of the political, battles of the 1990s. And you didn't hear the term red state or blue state until the 2000 election. It was basically election night 2000. Everybody looked up, saw it was a near perfect tie, if you remember, Bush versus Gore.
Right.
Came down to the extended recount in Florida. So the book is sort of in my view, it's my attempt to get at the kind of the origin story of that, because I think we've been living in kind of red and blue America, for 2 decades since. Right. And I think that in terms of the midterm elections, the key to the 1990s, the key to the book is 1994. 1994 was Bill Clinton's first midterm election.
Uh-huh.
I
Just
think
like Biden today.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of the template for the last generation of our politics was kind of set in 94, because it was, if folks remember, it was unfathomable. The idea heading into 1994, Bill Clinton was a Democratic president. He had a massive majority in the House. He had a big majority in the Senate, and the Democrats had controlled the House for 40 consecutive years, 1954 to 1994. And there was nothing heading into 1994 that made anybody think that was going to change. They called it the Permanent Democratic Congress. Even if it was a good Republican year, maybe they'd gain 10 or 20 seats and that would be it. But there was something, this Democratic majority was just absolutely locked in. Well, 1994 was the year of the Republican Revolution. It was a 54-seat gain. Republicans, it was a culmination of 2 years of very fierce Republican opposition to Bill Clinton, to the Democratic Congress. It was led by Newt Gingrich, who had really kind of emerged and transformed the Republican Party, really didn't believe much in the idea of compromise legislatively. He believed you got to use Congress, you got to use the legislative process to draw contrast between parties. And it was ironic that, when you talk to people around Gingrich about the road to that victory in 94, Gingrich had been there a long time before it happened. You say, what was the missing ingredient? And they'll tell you the missing ingredient they found out in 1994 was a Democratic president. The missing ingredient for Republicans was a president from the other party, because it gave their congressional minority something to unite against and put, it unified them. They united them. Everybody was on the same page. It got rid of all the internal party divisions. And it also was very effective in moving public opinion against Bill Clinton, against the Democrats, and producing this just massive midterm landslide for Republicans in 94. And it's a process now that we've kind of seen repeat a few times. 20 Republicans did it again, 63 seat gain when Barack Obama was president.
Right.
18 Democrats did it, 40 seat gain. We've seen the House flip a number of times now in the last generation. 94 was the first one of those.
So it might be a predictor of what will happen this year, or we might find there's a big surprise. Patrick, I'd like to turn to you to say a little something about who votes in this midterm election, because we know that every election has a different electorate. But from what we see in New Jersey and other places, we have about 50% turnout as opposed to something close to 70% with the presidential election. Who cares about this? As you look at who you want to poll from, can you give us some insight into this?
Yeah, well, at this point in time, maybe a pollster is the wrong person to ask about who will vote in an election. But there are things that we learned.
Generally speaking, yeah.
But seriously, and also actually continuing it with that same point, is it's becoming less predictable about who will vote in certain elections. One of the reasons why polling was fairly consistent was that it was the same pattern. If it was an odd year gubernatorial race like we have in New Jersey, there was a certain type of voter that came out, and there was some room around that where maybe a slightly larger group or slightly smaller group than normal would come out. Similarly with a congressional midterm, and it depends, in each state it depends. Is there a Senate race at the top of the ticket, or are they the House races at the top of the ticket? And you would build your models around that, and it'd be fairly predictable. If voters were more engaged because it was a competitive race, you would be able to figure that out in your polling. We're getting to the point where we're not quite sure. But if we look at 2018, and I think we're going to see something like 2018 this time around, is that we had incredibly high turnout in 2018 relative to any turnout that we had seen before for the midterm elections. And so I think we're going to see that again. What made actually the 2018 races fairly easy, or relatively more easy to poll, because you had an electorate that looked, while it wasn't quite up to a presidential level, the demographics of the electorate looked a lot like a presidential election. Mm-hmm. So we're probably going to see that again. But as I said, what we've seen in 2020, what we've seen in 2021 here in New Jersey, although not as much in Virginia, is in races where there isn't as much attention as we saw here in New Jersey's race versus Virginia's race, is that there's the potential for small movements in the polls, or small movements in the electorate to throw the polls off. Meaning, just take New Jersey as an example. If 75,000 fewer Republicans in South Jersey came out and they stayed home, and 75,000 more voters in North, or the urban part of North Jersey, the Democratic base came out, that 150,000 swing would have put Murphy close to 10 points. Rather than 3 points. Yeah. And in a poll of 1,000 voters, that's only 20 people in the sample. So that's how much, the shifts that become much more unpredictable now make it a lot harder to tell who's going to come out to vote. What we saw in New Jersey's race this year, and I keep coming back to New Jersey because it's just an easy thing to point to as something that was unusual, is it was the first time that I'd seen a New Jersey governor's race nationalized. Now, obviously, midterm is nationalized already, but it brought out the kinds of voters that we don't normally see. And it's going to be interesting to see whether we have a similar pattern in 2022 with that Republican presidential type of electorate coming out, and maybe the Democrats staying home in a way that they didn't do in 2018, or at least a number of Democrats in the base, particularly in urban areas, Black voters, Latino voters, not coming out in kind of the numbers that they would normally come out, in a way that could upset a few races that we might not be paying attention to.
Interesting. Steve, it seems to me that there's a lot of emphasis on redistricting, more than we've seen in terms of sort of public engagement and so on. Was this something that you saw in other races, or are you sensing that it's more intense and maybe more important in this election, like who doesn't have a chance to win because of redistricting, or who does? Are you watching that as you're doing your study for this election?
Yeah, I mean, the interest level, I mean, this just tracks with all things politics and all things elections. I have found over the last 5-10 years, maybe a little longer, certainly since 2016, the interest level, I just feel is through the roof. I feel like people are interested in politics and elections and now redistricting and gerrymandering at a level that was just, I can't find any parallel, in my lifetime. So there's been an incredible amount of interest in the redistricting process that's playing out in different states, across the country, right? It's significant that you could point to a couple of districts in different places where, decisions have been made that I think are going to be extremely consequential. New Jersey would be an example. It looks like Tom Malinowski got the worst deal of any New Jersey incumbent in the redraw in New Jersey. And you just look on paper at that district and you look at what Patrick was just saying, some of what 2021 seems to portend for 2022 puts it in a very difficult spot because of that redraw. And so there are plenty of examples like that in, around the country. Although I think that the interest level in it is so high and so bipartisan right now that one of the effects has been when you take a step back and kind of take in everything that's happened around the country, it doesn't point to a huge advantage for one party or another. You can pockets where the Democrats are going to probably carve out some wins that they otherwise wouldn't have. You're going to find pockets where Republicans can do the same. But I think it gets, each party base kind of views it as the magic thing that's going to give them an extra dozen or 2 dozen seats, or give the other side a dozen or 2 dozen seats. And I think in reality, it looks like it may be closer to a wash for all of the incredible amount of interest and energy that went into it.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that happened with that, Steve, is the way, when I was looking at it and looking at those numbers of where the electorate is, like, take New Jersey as an example, is probably part of it. I mean, it was a kind of a map that we thought the Democrats would propose in our commission to begin with. But I think after the 21 results, the gubernatorial results, it became even more clear that that's what they're going to do, because they felt they couldn't afford to put a good campaigner like Josh Gottheimer or Mikey Sherrill in as competitive a district as they might have before those 21 results. They needed to give them a little bit more of a cushion, which means Malinowski was going to be the one on the outs, throwing in Andy Kim in there as well. But to the idea that it's a wash in terms of how many seats are Republicans picking up, how many seats are the Democrats losing, that in the face of it is true, I think. But what I'm looking at, and Ingrid, this is much to your chagrin, is what's really happening is that the few competitive seats that we had to begin with are becoming far fewer. Is that even though that the Republicans aren't picking up many more seats in terms of the partisan index for those districts, is that they're solidifying where they are.
That was my impression when I first heard what the congressional redistricting folks did. Oh, the Democrats don't have to worry about 3 districts. They don't have to spend money there. And but what's also happening is they lost a lot of energy. A lot of that interest in the election came from people who weren't really party people, but volunteers, and were very determined to see those wins in 11 and 3, supporting Kim and Mikey Sherrill. That's not going to happen in this election. So you're really sort of tamping down that energy that we saw going into.
And this is happening now. This is happening nationally. So what you're seeing, what you saw in New Jersey with our bipartisan commission with an independent tiebreaker, actually is happening nationally in partisan processes as well. And as you said, Ingrid, going back to your first question, as a pollster, I'd much rather poll a competitive race, because when voters are engaged, it's much easier to poll them accurately. It's when they're disengaged that the odd things, the surprises can happen.
Right. Well, Steve, don't you think that's true of your business too? If you're up there with the board and there's really nothing exciting going on, or, wondering what's going to happen and who's, you're so good at the demography, who's going to turn out and make the difference in a particular state. It's just not as exciting if you know that 90% of the 435 districts you could sort of predict what the outcome is going to be now. Was my number too high, or what do you think?
Oh no, I think that is absolutely one of the other consequence here is just lack of competitive seats. Now, given how close the House is, you right now have less than 10 seats separating the two parties. House, this is about as close as it's ever been heading to the midterm election, even with a dramatically reduced playing field of competitive seats. That leaves, from my standpoint, that leaves plenty to plenty for us to be covering and plenty that could be that could be significant. But yeah, it's a dramatically reduced field. And the other thing, of course, is we'll be looking, it's the House and the 50-50 Senate. And, we've got 6 to 8 races there too that I think you can't gerrymander a state, so we've got that too.
So you're predicting that there will be some really interesting races then for the Senate that don't seem to be sure the way we know the districts are configured.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when you talk to Democrats too, they're generally pretty realistic, I think, about what their prospects are in 2022, just given the history, of how the opposition party tends to do well in that first midterm election. The poll numbers around Joe Biden right now and his approval rating, those numbers don't suggest that anything like ahistorical is going to happen. We'll see. We'll see how things out in 2022. Again, just given that incredibly narrow margin in the House right now, not like the Republicans need to make up 45 seats to get a majority. They just need to flip a handful of them and they'll have a majority. So when you talk to Democrats, they tend to kind of shift to the idea of holding on to the Senate. And it's a little bit more, you can see a path there for Democrats that would, for instance, Pennsylvania, you've got not seeking re-election. You've got a state that Joe Biden won narrowly, but Joe Biden did win in 2020. It's an open seat. There's an opportunity there for Democrats. If they win that seat, they are gaining a seat in the Senate. We'll talk about Wisconsin. Ron Johnson, the Republican, in his second term, he's running for a third term. This is as politically competitive a state as you can get. Biden did win it. It was 20,000 votes, so razor thin margin. Again, this is it's a very competitive state. So Democrats think about, could they win, in their view, both of those? And then, could they hang on in a place like Arizona? Could they hang on in a place like Georgia? We're going to have so much attention at all levels about Georgia in 22. They got a huge break, Democrats did, in New Hampshire a month or two ago. Joe Biden was invoking the governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, in his press conference yesterday. Chris Sununu, pretty popular governor in New Hampshire, political lineage. His dad was the governor of New Hampshire, John Sununu. He was the White House chief of staff under Bush 41. He passed up, Republicans nationally were begging him to run for the Senate next year, and he passed it up. And then Republicans had their second choice, passed it up. And so now it's suddenly Democrats are looking at New Hampshire as a seat where a few months ago they thought they were very likely to lose it. They may be able to hang on. So I think when you talk get Democrats to kind of talk, you give them a little truth serum or whatever, they got the House as being something they don't really expect to keep, but the Senate they think they have a shot at.
Really? Okay. What do you think, Patrick? I mean, weren't there more Democrats leaving their seats? I guess that's in the House than Republicans. So they have more seats they have to fill. Is it good to be a non-incumbent?
I'm not sure. I mean, you look at the patterns there. There's a mix of competitive seats and non-competitive seats where there's going to be vacancies. Some people just want out because of the tone in Washington right now. But then you also have on the Republican side some folks getting out as well, who are not running for re-election, who were some of those who supported, for example, voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump, realizing that they're probably going to lose a primary in those seats. But The thing is, because the map was narrow to begin with and it's narrower, it's just exactly what Steve said. It really doesn't matter at the House level because there's just, all it takes is literally a handful, 5 seats here and there. They're going to flip towards a Republican, and considering where the national mood is right now, that has to happen. So there's no way that you can't. So yeah, you are looking at the Senate races, and Steve pointed out that I think the Pennsylvania vacancy is probably one of the biggest ones that we're looking at. But I'm just wondering, when we're talking about states that were close, states where Democrats could potentially have a shot, like Wisconsin. If the mood of the electorate is as it is today, it would take a very good Democratic candidate and a very bad Republican candidate, I think, to pick up those seats.
Let's talk about the mood today and what in the last few weeks, it seems like in your business, Patrick, everybody was polling to find out what people thought of the president, and then making comparison with Trump and so on. I gather that the rating of the president has a very big impact on the midterm election. Has that always been the case?
Yeah, that's historically been the case. And so we have a president right now who's a near record low. Only Donald Trump basically is beating him at this point in terms of Joe Biden's approval rating, which is ranging anywhere from 33% to the low 40s. Today's NBC poll was 43%, right, Steve, for Biden's approval rating. So that range suggests that that you knock off 5 points for the Democrats to just start with in any midterm election at that point. So we have enough races at both at the Senate level and at the House level that you would put within a 5-point range to begin with. That suggests that that's really tough because of where the president is right now. Because the president indicates, is Washington getting anything done? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the key here. And that's, again, you mentioned Steve's book, and Steve's book, basically points to the origin story of Washington not getting anything done in the modern era, which is the victory of Newt Gingrich and a discovery by the Republicans. If you get into power and you stymie the president of the opposing party, you can continue to hold on to power. And so we moved from, and there's some great stories in Steve's book. Also, there's a couple other books out that also focus around this area. Where you had folks like the Bob Doles of the world, who it was anathema to them to not try to seek out some compromise, try to get some things done, try to get a budget passed, and basically being told, no, we're going to stand up to Clinton, we're going to shut down the government because we believe, and in the short term that proved wrong, but in the long term, that as a strategy, they realized, well, we might not be in power every cycle, but we're not going to be locked out of power for 40 years if we do this. And so we're in a situation right now. Similar thing happened. You look at Barack Obama's approval ratings right when he first became president, super high, because there was a lot of hope. As soon as the Republicans said, we are not going to work with you the way that Democrats worked with President Bush on the economic recovery, the fallout from Lehman and the fiscal problems that we had back from 2008. Once the Republicans said that, we saw Barack Obama's numbers go down. Why? Because he's the president and he's supposed to get things done. If he doesn't get things done, if Washington stops working, at the end, as the famous Harry Truman plaque, the buck stops here.
Steve, do you think that if that's ever been reversed, or does the president have to go out of office and you start all over again? Can you ever bounce back? The president.
You could certainly bounce back. I mean, the history to really zoom out on these midterm elections, if you go back to 1938.
Okay.
There are only 2 examples of midterm elections since 1938 where the White House party has gained seats. Every other midterm election, the White House party has lost seats, often dozens of seats. There are 2 times in all of that when the president actually went into a midterm election with a certain number of seats in Congress and came out with more. And they are 1998, when Bill Clinton was, Republicans were, they had opened an impeachment inquiry. They hadn't actually impeached him yet, but they had served notice that they were going to impeach Bill Clinton. They did that a month before the midterm election. The impeachment was very unpopular, and Clinton's approval rating crept up near 70%. And on election day, Democrats gained 5 seats in the House of Representatives.
Yeah,
and
who would have believed?
Catastrophic.
Yeah.
Catastrophic for Republicans. Newt Gingrich was pushed out as the speaker 3 days later because of that 98 election. And the only other example is in 2002. It's a year after 9/11. George W. Bush still has that kind of, bipartisan halo around him. His approval rating is also near 70%. And again, Republicans, I believe, gained 5 seats in 2002. Every midterm election, the White House party has lost seats. So that's the history that comes into this. But yeah, in terms of bouncing back, I mentioned, the Bill Clinton 1994 debacle kind of setting the modern template. Part of the modern template is Clinton took it on the chin. Democrats took it on the chin in 94, and it gave Bill Clinton a foil in 1995 and 1996. That was Newt Gingrich. That was the Republican Congress. And Bill Clinton won re-election with ease in 1996. Barack Obama lost the Congress in 2010, and it gave him a foil in 2011 and 2012. John Boehner, the Tea Party, remember that campaign?
Yeah.
That's what he ran against, and he was re-elected. Donald Trump lost the Congress in 2018. I mean, Trump was in perpetual war with everybody, but he lost 40 seats in the House, and he came within, in 2020, 40,000 votes, about 42,000 votes across 3 states of winning re-election. So even Trump, battered as he was by the 2018 midterms, mathematically did not come that far from winning re-election.
It's interesting that the 2 of the examples are really within our very recent history. And maybe that means it could happen again, or maybe we have to have another 30 years before we see it turn around.
But I think we're seeing something unusual in the electorate now, though, because we see these patterns, and the pattern would predict that the Democrats are going to lose the House. But we're also in a pattern where partisan identity is much more rigid than it has been in the past, in our polling. Even though there's some fluidity in terms of, how many Republicans, how many Democrats, and there's a Gallup number that came out that suggested that Republicans, they ended the year with more Republicans and Democrat identifiers than when they started. I didn't see that in our polling at Monmouth over the course of the year, and that's one of the problems with partisan identity and the questions that we ask in polling and how they're very fluid. But it's much harder to convince folks to move large numbers of folks with arguments as there was in the past. I think I saw a map from 1984, a map of New Jersey election results. I remember 1984, Ronald Reagan won New Jersey with about 60% of the vote, and Bill Bradley won New Jersey with over 60% of the vote. So that kind of ticket splitting, we will never see that again. But the thing is, now we have so many elections and states that are close, where the electorate is divided so much, so close to 50-50 in terms of their preferences. We saw that in Virginia, for example, is that it only takes small movements to change an outcome of an election. Right. Small movements in the electorate. Now, you don't need big movements because even though we're less fluid in who we're going to vote for, that we are now becoming almost divided directly in half.
I think that we should explore some more about polling. Steve, when we talked about this and thought it was a good idea to have Patrick join in, you had read an op-ed kind of analysis that you pointed pointed out to me, where Patrick really was willing to talk about something that we hadn't been able to talk about in polite society, and that is, I characterize it as what good are polls if they don't predict the results. I think, I don't want to speak for you, but is that what you found interesting about Patrick's piece before we ask him to explain it? What relevance did you see it had in our society?
Yeah, no, and well, Patrick, I'm sure will explain it all here in a minute for folks who haven't seen it, but it was, you know, when a pollster writes an op-ed saying, hey, maybe it's time we stop doing polls, or at least horse race polls. I think that's going to catch anybody's attention. What do they say? You know, dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is news. But it's look, we've all been having this conversation since 2016, when you know, the polls were wrong and Donald Trump was elected president, and there were misses in 2020, and it in some ways almost happened again. And there've been, you know, obviously cases I'm sure everybody can point to between here and there. So this has just been the question of what has changed in polling, what's wrong in polling, what's fixable in polling, what can be fixed in polling. This has been an ongoing conversation, certainly in the political media world, you know, for 5 years now. And I think Patrick just, let him explain it here, but made it very,
and I guess it goes along with something I want to ask you about, of the election administration not really working well. If the polls don't do what they in effect promise, and that is give some idea of where the campaign is, and have some semblance of reality once we know how voters have voted, what are they doing in the campaign? How are they affecting what voters do? So Patrick, the floor is yours to tell us what you wrote and why you wrote it.
Well, you know, I polled both New Jersey and Virginia gubernatorial races, and our Virginia numbers were fine, but using the same methodology in New Jersey, they were off. And as I explained before, you know, there was a difference of about 150,000 voters that we didn't predict accurately in the way that they were going. And that's all the difference in the world, a difference of 10 to 20 respondents in our polls. And we had this problem in 2020. We had a problem in 2016, and there were folks saying, you know, maybe people are lying to you and so forth. And I saw that was one of the questions coming up, so I'll try to address it here. In 2016, we found some key methodological things that we could fix. Part of but you know, one of them had to do with the education of the electorate and the education of our poll samples. And certainly in 2018, we were fine. The polls were basically back to their normal process. But there was something that happened in 2016 that really bothered me, because when we went back and validated who voted and who didn't, and from our poll samples, we found that a contributor to the error there was that we overestimated the turnout among Hillary Clinton voters, meaning people who told us they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton, told us they were going to vote, didn't actually go out to vote. And they were more likely to do that than Donald Trump voters. And in the back, we didn't have a reason why. I mean, we didn't go back and quantify this, but you know, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, part of it was that these were voters that we saw were not overly enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. And perhaps the reason was that the media and the polling was saying Hillary Clinton's going to win this thing. And if you're not enthusiastic about who you're going to vote for, and you think that person's going to win, you don't need to sully your hands by going out there and voting for that person. Mm-hmm. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, did polls contribute to that? Right. You know, so we got to 2018 and said, okay, look, we fixed that, because my concern is that are we creating an accurate narrative? And that's what my op-ed was about. Mm-hmm. Is that we don't have to be exactly right, because when you're doing election polling, you're violating some of the rules of polling. You're trying to predict what a population will look like on election day, which is not what polling is supposed to do. Polling is supposed to say, we know what the population already looks like. We already have the data on that population. And then we just go out and poll them accurately. In election polling, we're trying to make a prediction of, well, what is the electorate going to look like? So in 2020, we had that problem again. wasn't a, by the way, in polling terms, it wasn't a huge miss in 2020. It was a consistent miss across the board, and that's what created the narrative was off. But in methodological terms, statistical terms, it was not a huge miss in terms of the kind of error that's involved in polling. But because it was across the board, it created a narrative. And one of the problems that we have is that we can't convey to people well enough the amount of error that is naturally that you should, the grain of salt, how big the grain of salt is that you should take polling with when you're talking about an election poll, a likely voter model poll. And so when we went into 2021, all this was in the back of my head. And I want to see, well, is it just a Trump phenomenon? Is it something that only happens when Trump is on the ballot? And in 21, we saw it, our polling is fine. If it's a competitive race, it was off by enough in a non-competitive race, even though the numbers weren't huge in polling terms, they were huge in terms of the narrative. So we had a narrative, and this is what bothered me. We had a narrative in New Jersey that I contributed to, that the Monmouth poll contributed to, that Phil Murphy had this in the bag. Mm-hmm. People weren't paying attention to this election, and he had it in the bag. And that's what bothered me, was that we were contributing to a narrative that was not right, is that this was a closer election. And in fact, there were other metrics in our poll that were accurate. We had Phil Murphy at 51% job approval rating. We showed a clear shift in issue priorities in the last month of the election, away from COVID and towards more economic issues, which would suggest that the Republican would do better. We also showed Jack Ciattarelli, who had extremely low name recognition, which he did. He didn't win. He didn't do as well as he did because of name recognition. He did as well as he did as an anti-Murphy, anti-Democrat vote. But because we weren't focusing as much on those metrics, but we were focusing on that horse race number, we were conveying the wrong narrative. And in the past, we would get polls. We would get occasional polls wrong. And we would say, well, look, we're going to do better. Don't, worry about it. And people would, by and large, trust us. I think we're in a stage right now where people don't trust us, that they think there's something nefarious. An honest mistake is now nefarious, that you're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. You are fake news. And I think, I am looking at this as, somebody who is very much interested in the history and the future of the Republic, saying, well, what contribution am I making to that? What contribution am I making to public trust? Because it's this undermining of public trust that goes back to the Newt Gingrich years, the kind of let's make government not work. Let's erode trust in public institutions, including the media, and the polling is part of that, that I have to think about what I am going to, do in the future. So one of the things that I threw down is the question of, should we be doing the horse race question anymore? Not election polling. We should be asking about the candidates. We should be asking about the issues. The question is, should we be asking the horse race question? Who's ahead? Who's behind by how many points? And that's kind of I'm thinking about, I'm talking to folks, my friends in the media like Steve, and asking them questions and trying to figure out, well, what kind of example can I set looking forward in 2022?
Well, in a way, you're saying that you affected the election in a way, not that it wasn't honest, but it wasn't sort of accurate, or it affected how people might have voted, given either their trust or their interest. And it seems to me that, Steve, your experience with elections not functioning in as you found, in an effective way when you couldn't get results, was also in effect undermining the basic trust that we want people to have in elections, and that you in your careers, you each have a problem of having elections that really respect the voter, and don't create problems or suspicions about what's going on. Would you say, Steve, that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that sort of one result of you struggling to find out the result of an election on the screen?
The reporting of election results on election night, or election week, as it's now becoming in some places, as it was in New Jersey this past November, I think is a significant issue, and I think there's a lot that goes into it, because each state is going to do it differently. Each state is going to have different equipment. Each state's going to have different rules when it comes to, do we have early voting? How long is the early voting period for? Do we have mail voting? How long is the mail-in voting period? Do you automatically send ballots to every voter in the state? Do they have to apply for there are all sorts of, permutations to this. We've seen just a dramatic expansion in general, expansion of the ways that people can vote, that the timetables that they have to vote under. The last really, I'd say, 5-10 years. There are some states that have been at this for a while, but I think the things that's becoming clear to me is a lot of, not the states necessarily, the states will pass these changes and then tell the counties and tell the municipalities, okay, implement it. Okay, we've got early voting now. Okay, you're going to get flooded with 60,000 mail-in ballots. You got to get them. And I think it's New Jersey, I think, is a textbook example of this, what just happened in November. Because one of the simplest things I think that New Jersey did wrong in November is they did not allow the processing of the mail-in ballots until basically midnight on election day. So these, election officials are getting inundated with mail-in ballots. And the process of getting that ballot verified and counted is cumbersome. You've got to verify the identity of the voter. You've got to open it up, verify the identity. You got to sift through these things. You can't just, put everything in a machine and be done with it. There's a process before you can even put something in a machine. And I think it slowed down a lot of the vote counting in New Jersey. I think there's all sorts of issues too. Ingrid, I'm sure you could speak to this with training, with equipment, there were machines that ended up getting impounded, then court order to get them out. But the bottom line is, that there was this pretty dramatic expansion in New Jersey. And New Jersey is not the only state where this has happened. A pretty dramatic expansion in the ways people have to vote. And the ability to implement those changes in a way that produces timely results has just not been produced yet. It doesn't have to be this way. A model in my mind, ironically, is the state that is the site of the worst election night disaster in modern history, and that's Florida. Florida made changes after 2000, and Florida have a 2-week early voting period. They have mail-in voting. They have same-day voting. And a lot of people participate in all those different methods. Florida has a state law that, first of all, as the mail-in ballots come in, they're processed. They don't wait all till election day to do it. And they have a state law that within 30 minutes of poll closing on election night, every county has to report out all of the totals of all of the mail ballots and all of the in-person early voting that's taken place in that county. And that's going to be about 60-65% of the vote. So I remember this from election night 2020. We knew going in that Florida was going to be the earliest state to be reported. So we were really ready to go on Florida. And in that first half hour to hour, 7 o'clock hour on the East Coast, everything except the Panhandle, which is the central time zone, one county after another was lighting up, and you knew exactly what you were getting. You were getting the mail-in ballots, and you were getting the early in-person voting. You were getting about 2/3 of the vote in every county. And so it was you knew what the number was. You knew what that number represented. And then in the course of the next 2-3 hours, all of the counties reported out their same-day vote. And we had a winner, massive state of Florida, politically competitive. Trump ended up winning it by, I think, 2.5-3 points. We had a winner declared in the state of Florida by about 11 o'clock on election night. And I think that's it. Now Florida's had really 10
a little practice
of doing this, but I think I think a lot of states would do well to take a close look at Florida, because you get in a situation like New Jersey. And I remember 2-3 days after the election, people were getting irritated that Chitterelli hadn't conceded yet, and don't you understand that there's no mathematical path? And my position on it was, no, I'll give Chitterelli leeway. If these counties can't tell you exactly how many votes they have left, if they can't tell you exactly what kind they've counted and what kind they haven't counted, if they can't provide that basic information, I knew looking at it that it didn't look like Chitterelli had much of a shot. But if he wants a couple of days when counties can't produce that kind of information, he or any candidate, I think, has the right to do that. And that's not the failure of a candidate. That's not the failure of people to believe it. That's the failure of the system.
Mm-hmm. So you have people not being sure what they should believe about polls, which they had trusted, and what they can believe or what they could get in a timely fashion from election administration. And they can be pretty cynical about how the system is working, what they should really believe.
Right, because those late polls, right, because as we've seen, the mode that you vote, the Democrats are more likely to vote in early modes.
Yeah.
Republicans are more likely to vote on election day modes. Depends what gets counted first, what gets counted last. And so that opens up the conspiracy theory that somebody's pulling votes out or shoving votes in that week that follows election day, even though that's not happening. And we've seen evidence that it's not happening, but you can't get away from that as a problem that undermines trust.
We promised people we would take their questions. We've got to stop having this good time talking about all of these things and see what people want to know. So Kim, can you give us some questions?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, first a fun one. Marco Goddardis says, Steve, thanks for speaking to us. 2 questions. Did you finish that bottle that Rachel Maddow gifted to you from her office after the last election? And then his other question is, what are your thoughts on forms of local government in towns and small cities? Do you think there's a trend towards nonpartisan governments?
Okay.
On the first one, no, haven't finished it yet. But I guess my understanding with that stuff is the longer you hold on to it, the more it accrues value. So maybe maybe that's a good strategy there.
Okay.
In terms of the partisan election versus nonpartisan election, my general sense is it gets to what Patrick was talking about earlier, where how just polarized, lack of split ticket voting, the sorting out of the world kind of into red and blue camps. I think even without partisan labels, people figure it out, and there's sort of informal coordination, informal signals get sent, and I think even in places where you have nonpartisan elections, you end up having kind of in practice partisan elections.
We've been seeing that with a lot of board of education elections. Right?
Yeah.
The Republicans have been running campaigns where they've been pushing their candidate and informing their base about which candidate is their candidate. Yeah.
So what do you think, Patrick?
About how long Steve should hold on to that bottle?
Yeah, he probably could use some advice.
By the way, my favorite moment, my favorite Steve moment on election night 2020 didn't involve Steve at all. It involved Ali Velshi filling in for Steve in one of the few moments where they had to pull Steve. You have to pull Steve. I've worked with Steve over at NBC. You have to pull him away from the big board. There's no way to do it. But it was Leslie Jones yelling, "Where's Steve? This is not Steve." Steve. And if you search for that on Twitter, it was hilarious. But nonpartisan, yeah, I agree with Steve. I don't see any greater movement to nonpartisan elections right now.
I should note that Senator Zwicker says, Steve is correct, and we are working now to make sure we fix New Jersey's reporting requirements before the midterm. So we have a couple of questions about voting. Reem Iverson asks, how do you see voter suppression play out in our upcoming elections? Will we actually have a fair election?
Wow.
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, right? And of course, we had, there's a lot of blowback from the president's comments at his press conference yesterday about whether the results would be legitimate. I think if I'm going to flip this question around a little bit. I think one of the problems that one of the reasons why the Voting Rights Act failed is because the president came to this too late in the game with his speech in Georgia. If this truly was an existential crisis for the republic, then you need to be beating that drum since the moment you take office. He didn't do that, and so that enabled Republicans and those who didn't want to change this legislation or push this legislation the ability to say, look, this is just about which party gets advantage in an election. So Democrats want more people to vote so they can win. Republicans don't, or Republicans want to, make it more greater integrity in making sure that the voting is secure, which means they're going to win. But for Republicans, that's a win. If it's all about which party is going to gain advantage from these things, it's going to win. But I can't answer the question about will it happen. I mean, we're going to have to just wait and see.
Yeah. Steve, do you have an opinion on that?
I just tend to think it's, when you look at it, each side is kind of convinced. You talk to a Republican, and Republicans are going to tell you that voter fraud is costing them X. You talk to a Democrat, they're going to talk about voter suppression, and they're going to say this is this is costing us a huge amount in these elections. I think when I look at it, I can see evidence that, for instance, in Georgia, in the last couple elections, I think the attention that was paid by Democratic activists, by Democratic candidates, the attention that was paid to what Republican elected officials were trying to do, I think, my view, likely produced higher turnout among the groups that Democrats say, are being targeted. I think Republicans seem convinced, each side seems convinced of something that I'm not convinced is true. Republicans seem convinced that the larger the electorate gets, that's it, they're not going to win. Democrats seem convinced that the larger the electorate gets, they can't lose. And I think 2020, and I think Trump, you look at the Trump coalition, the unlikely voters, the people he brought out, some of the trends in the party coalitions, I think introduce a lot of nuance into that. I think I don't believe that it's a rule at all that higher turnout automatically means success for Democrats and failure for Republicans. I think Republicans can win and do win in higher turnout, extremely high turnout, scenarios. And so it's interesting to watch the debate play out, because I think there's an assumption that Republicans, in trying to pursue these laws, Democrats in trying to fight these laws, there's an assumption they're each bringing to it that I don't think necessarily matches up with reality.
Yeah, I think we saw that in New Jersey remember, we had 22%, I think, higher turnout in 2021 than 2017, and we had a significantly closer race than we should have because of who turned out. But I don't think turnout's going to be the issue about the election integrity. I think it could turn out on the actual administrative processes of counting the votes.
Right.
And we're seeing a lot of states change the rules about who is in control of that process. So that's going to be something new in a number of states in 2022 that we're going to have to pay attention to.
Right. The other part of this is, if you want people to vote who haven't been voting, highly educated, more wealthy people and so on, you have to make it simple. You can't expect people to have to get a birth certificate to show what their date of birth that they are allowed to vote, or that they have to go and register in one place and then go and vote in another place. That really is just voter suppression of people who already are very busy and probably can't find time in their day. I know that among young people, if you tell them that there's another step involved, forget it. They're the ones that are really happy about voting by mail, because they think it's easier to do it. But once you have to go and send in a form to get a vote by mail ballot, that doesn't work. But if it gets sent to you and you can watch for it and fill it out and know where you can deposit it, it helps. But I think too many voting practices now are too complicated, and that's part of the problem. You have to find out where the drop box is and drive there, or go and vote in person at a certain time that is different than the time you would go if you go to the polls. I think we've made voting more complicated, which suppresses the vote. So, and it has nothing to do with party. It has to do with convenience and and how easy it is for people to do it. Okay, another question. I shouldn't be giving my opinion on this. Who has another question, Kim?
Ingrid, you've been working on this a lot. You've been working on that for many years, so you deserve to get your point of view in there.
Hear, hear.
Okay, I guess we have time for at least one more or two more questions.
Oh gosh, okay, down to two. Okay. Well, here's a low pressure one. Edward Denton asks, what's your view on who the Republican candidate will be in 2024?
Okay, there you go.
Who do you want to? Well, I'll talk first, I guess. I think Donald Trump is going to run, and I think if you take a poll on the Republican side, it's I mean, this is not, it's not close, and I think the behavior of Republican elected officials, to me, strongly indicates that they still, view him as, the voice of their party, the person who more than anyone else has a hold on their voters, their party's voters. It's an unusual situation. I was trying to think the last time you had a former president who was a viable and interested contender in running again. You got to go back to Gerald Ford, who almost ran in 1980 after losing in 1976. Otherwise we've had this tradition of the one-term president. Well, the one-term president has been Carter and Bush Sr. since then, and neither one of them ever showed any interest in running again. We're just in a totally different situation here. But I think, look, he's 75 years old, I believe. There's just in general, there's always the question of health with anybody. But beyond that, I think Trump's giving every indication he wants to run again. And I've since 2015, I have seen a million different theories for, this is why Trump's lost his hold on the Republican base. This is why things are different now. Look at this poll number we haven't seen before. At this point, I'm not buying it.
Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, there was an interesting number in today's NBC poll, which was, the question is, and it's asked of Republicans, do you consider yourself more a Donald Trump supporter or more a Republican Party supporter? And the Donald Trump supporter number was at 36%, which a lot of people were looking at, say, touting it. That's a record low in this poll going back, I guess, you've been asking that question for 2 or 3 years now, maybe more. Because it's usually somewhere between 43 and 50 some percent who say they're a Donald Trump supporter. So it's 36%. So, but there's two things I want to say about that. One is Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party in his image. So what's the difference between being a Republican supporter and a Trump supporter at this point? But also, I should point out that Donald Trump, while he's remade it in his image, I don't think he controls that anymore. I think, some of the reaction that we've seen from crowds at some of his rallies when he's gone off the orthodoxy and talked about vaccinations and so forth, and they've booed him. But Donald Trump's smart enough to know I need to get back on board with that. The other thing that I want to say about that 36% number, in a multi-candidate field, 36% wins you the nomination. So there it is, if he does run.
Okay. Very nice. Very clear, everybody. Another one, Kim?
We have so many questions we're not going to be able to get to. I think it's only fair that we say, who do you think the Democrat running for president will be in 2024?
That's a good one.
Who the Democrat will be?
Yeah.
I thought what was interesting was Biden had an interview in the last month when he gets asked the question all the time, does he want to run again? And when the question was put to him specifically, if Trump is running again, would that make you more or less likely to run? He perked up and said, I'm running if it's Trump. So, I suspect, I think that was a window into his motivation a little bit there. And so if I'm sitting here saying I expect Trump to run again, and I at this point do not see who's taking the Republican nomination from him. I think, again, Joe Biden to be 82 at the end of 2024. You have the question, and he says it himself. He says, health permitting, But I think if I'm right on Trump running again, I think Biden runs again.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and since I look at this from the point of view of voters and what they're likely to do, the only thing I can say is if Joe Biden decides to run again, then he will be the nominee, barring something very bizarre happening again. And if he decides not to run again, I have absolutely no clue who will be the nominee.
Okay. All right, Kim, can we take another one?
Certainly. Let me see.
The last one? I'm looking at
Yes.
the time. Okay.
Okay, so is polling more difficult because the respondents are less truthful with the pollster?
That's a great question. And I kind of alluded to it, and I think I never got to it when we were talking about a prior topic. There is some of that going on. I think people have admitted to that, that they're not entirely truthful. And we've always faced that problem, and because of social desirability, the way people want to answer questions. And what we're finding now, even when we ask questions that in the past had little to do with politics, such as, oh, is your family finances, are you getting ahead? Are you falling behind? Are you holding steady? What we're finding is a much higher correlation with the answers to those questions with the person's partisan identity and the party of the person who's in the White House than we had ever seen before. You always see some of that, you want to buck up your own side or not, but there was enough honesty out there that we could get movement. The only time we get movement in that question now is when, the president changes party. And that's a fairly new phenomenon. And that means, people are probably being less truthful with themselves as well, not just with pollsters, but with themselves. But in terms of people out and out lying to pollsters, I think the bigger problem that we have is that there is a small but measurable segment of the public who skew to one side of the political spectrum, who will not participate in polls, will not talk to pollsters. And that's the bigger problem that we have. Our response rates are low, and they have been low for quite some time. But going back 5, 6, 7 years ago, that there wouldn't be a particular skew or bias in terms of who we got in our polls versus who refused to talk to us. We're seeing that there's now probably a 2, 3, 4, 5 point bias to the left in who talks to us versus who doesn't talk to us. In our standard polling about public policy issues, anything from COVID vaccinations to anything else, any other topical issue of the day, we can basically correct for that within a couple of points. In an election poll, you throw that out the window. We can't correct for that because now you're taking an error on top of an error of saying, okay, these people will talk to us. Now we're trying to use that to predict a subset of who's going to turn out to vote. And that's kind of what I was talking about in my op-ed. This is the problem that we face in trying to get polls to do something that we don't. If we're already having some error when we start with our base sample, then that error is just simply going to be compounded. So that's the problem that I think we face more, is just people who distrust institutions skewing to one side and throwing our polls off by a few percent.
Thank you. I think I'm getting the signal that our time is up. I want to thank both Patrick and Steve. Steve, thanks for coming back again. We hope you'll do that next year for the 4th session. And Patrick, thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us some new perspectives. Polling is a part of our society, and it is important, and we need to think about it hard. And we really appreciate what you're doing in being honest and making it as best as it can be. So to all of you who tuned in or watched us, thank you for taking an interest in our politics and getting started on thinking of this next important election that's coming up. Thanks to the library and to the adult school, and of course, especially to our 2 guests. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.